you're right. I mean, the identity question is a deep one. There's a very brilliant insight that another French philosopher, I sound like I'm taking money from the French philosophers' trade union tonight. I doubt. Well, they trade unionize everything in France, almost certainly, and they get like all the year off. But they Michel. It was Finkelkraut said something interesting in an interview just a few weeks ago. He said, in France, we had for a time the dream that France would sort of, France up the world, that sort of the world would become more French and all that. And obviously we all know how that worked. And but the thing is that now we've retreated in this position where we're saying, could we at least have it for ourselves? Which is a heck of a retraction to go through in, well, just over half a century. But I think this is the thing that politicians find it almost impossible, everyone other than the far right. Basically, politicians find it almost impossible to talk to, which is a sense of cultural unease, which you feel everywhere now, I would argue, in Western Europe.
I think Nigel Farage has an interesting phrase. I think he's really come up with it. That you often hear in the Middle Eastern political science, you're studying Middle East, you always hear this term called the Arab Street.
Yes,
right? The Arab
exactly.
Street. I think Nigel Farage has come up with a concept, what he calls the man in the bar in Germany.
Yes.
The man in the bar, and I think it quite speaks to the differences that you were speaking of. Oh, okay.
And we call him Joe Sixpack in the U.S.
They call you Joe Sixpack. What? Oh, okay. I don't know.
Do you think there's a risk that while the threat from excessive immigration is quite real, you empower, and not you particularly, but the sort of people point this out, empower these parties that are here and now threats of this sort of vile anti-democratic behavior? Certainly in Britain, I think you've eradicated these parties, and here I think some would argue we put one of them in the White House, but I think he's certainly not as extreme as Roy Moore, for example. But part of the narrative of these parties is that we're in an existential crisis, and Islam is the other side of that. They sort of preach this Manichaean view, and certainly Roy Moore says there's Sharia law in Illinois. But all these parties, one of the things that unifies them is to say that the threat of Islam is encroaching, and all the mainstream parties, left, right, center, will fail you, and we are the only one that can save you.
But again, there's an obvious answer to that.
Yeah.
So.
But wait, sorry. One of the things you said is that the left, right, and center have failed to account for this. You don't think by sort of advancing that narrative you play into these groups' electoral interests?
I mean, it's possible. I wouldn't have thought so, because if I did, I would encourage people to vote for them. Which I don't. What I have consistently said, and what I say in the book at the end, not to give away the ending, is that there is such a bloody obvious answer to this, which is that the mainstream realise that what the majority of the public want is something they should be able to talk to. It is a very strange position you're in when mainstream parties think that the majority of the public's opinion is a sort of wacky, kooky, out there, mad thought disease. Or at least I would strongly urge them to reconsider, and do urge them to reconsider that. And just very quickly, the reason why the Sharia thing, by the way, has taken off on those fringes you describe, and is wildly over, we've got to pass the law, otherwise we'll be living under Sharia in Pennsylvania. The only reason that they get any oxygen is because on the very few occasions when there is a genuine worry, those mainstream politicians refuse to speak to it. So we had in Britain, I wrote about this 10 years ago, we had a set of Sharia courts that were operating in the UK which have the right to arbitrate. They don't have the right to go beyond the British law, but they have the right to arbitrate. And this is debatable about whether we should or shouldn't, but that's what it is. And I and others discovered that there were a number of courts in the UK that were using arbitration to, among other things, deny British women of their rights. because the women in question, if they were a Muslim background, did not know their rights under British law and only knew their rights under Sharia law. And that was happening in Birmingham, as I say, 10 years ago. Now, the public really worry about this because they don't like the sound of it. And the politicians, and then, of course, we had the idiot Archbishop of Canterbury, the aspirant Grand Mufti of Canterbury, as I called him at the time, who stupidly gave this speech in 2008 where he said, yes, I think Sharia law will have a future in the UK. I mean, how much worse do you want to make this situation, Archbishop? And so that's the problem we're in, is that everywhere, when there is a legitimate worry, the mainstream politicians don't find a way to address it or stampede away from it, leaving this ground open for people who, among other things, are willing to make any old crap up.